Chapter 7 of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. The Carew murder case. It was nearly a year later that all of London was shocked by a hateful and horrible crime. Mr. Danvers Carew, a well-known politician, was murdered. The details were few and startling. A maid in Dr. Jekyll's house had gone to bed at about 11 o'clock. Her room overlooked an alley that was brilliantly lit by the full moon. She sat at the window for some time, looking over the beautiful scene. Later, she told police that it was the most beautiful night she had ever experienced, until she saw two men in the alley. The maid noticed an old man walking through the alley first. He was well dressed and had a beautiful mane of white hair. She could see his face clearly in the brilliant moonlight. She thought he looked handsome and kind. Then she saw another man walking toward him. The second man was small and wore a heavy coat and dark hat. As they approached one another, the older man bowed to the second man. The maid thought that the older man was asking for directions. The old man held up a piece of paper and pointed down the alley. As she could see his face clearly, she knew he was calm and rather jolly. He even laughed. Then she noticed the face of Mr. Hyde. She recognized him as the sometime visitor of her master. Hyde held a heavy cane in his hand. He was swinging it by his side. All of a sudden, Hyde raised the cane above his head. The older gentleman took a step back, but it did not help. The maid watched in horror as Hyde swung the cane. The older gentleman fell to the ground. The maid fainted. When she woke up several hours later, she ran to the police to report the murder. They responded at once. At first, they did not know the victim's name, but they discovered a letter on his body. It was addressed to Mr. Utterson. The lawyer was awoken from his bed in the middle of the night to identify the body. He went with the police to the hospital where the body was waiting. His first thought was that Dr. Jekyll had been killed. He was very nervous and frightened for his friend. It took a great deal of courage for the lawyer to look at the body. He did not know what he would do if it was Jekyll. "I recognize him," Utterson said. "I am sorry to say that this is Sir Danvers Carew." "No, this case will be in all the morning papers," the police officer said. He shook his head in amazement. "Sir, we are all hoping you will have some knowledge of this criminal." The police then told him that the maid's story of Mr. Hyde beating Carew with a cane. Mr. Utterson was taken aback. "Hyde, did you say?" He was shocked that Hyde would have a connection with someone else he knew, especially Sir Danvers Carew, who he had been prepared for Hyde to have hurt or even killed Dr. Jekyll, but not Carew. Utterson wondered if anyone was safe from Mr. Hyde. The lawyer looked quite ill. "Yes, sir," the police officer said. "He used his cane as the murder weapon." The officer passed the walking stick to Utterson. The lawyer gasped. He recognized it as the gift he had given to Dr. Jekyll several years before. Jekyll must have given it to Hyde, or Hyde had stolen it. Utterson did not mention this fact to the police. He knew that he was hiding evidence, but he was concerned for his friend. He wanted to talk to Jekyll first. There was a more important matter at the hand, though. Hyde must be found and arrested. Utterson knew where to look. The lawyer still had the strange man's card in his wallet. "If you will come with me," Utterson said, shaking his head sadly, "I can take you to Mr. Hyde's apartment." Chapter 8. Mr. Hyde's apartment. Utterson took the police to Hyde's apartment in Soho. By this time, it was 9 o'clock in the morning. The streets were full of people. Hyde Street was filled with closed stores and run-down buildings. Children wearing little more than rags sat on steps. Men begged for a change on the street corner. Utterson wondered again how Dr. Jekyll had met someone from this neighborhood. He was also reminded of how much Hyde must want to inherit Jekyll's fortune. It would certainly allow him to move away from Soho. A policeman knocked. A woman with silver hair answered the door. Her face was wrinkled and hard. The policeman asked if this was the home of Mr. Edward Hyde. She said that this was his home, but he was not in. "He doesn't always stay here, you know," she answered. "As a matter of fact, last night was the first time I'd seen him in months." She was confused by the policeman's arrival. What did they want with Mr. Hyde? She could tell that something exciting had happened. Perhaps Hyde had committed some crime. She couldn't wait to hear all the details. She was already planning what she would say to her neighbors. "He was only here for about an hour, though," she added. "May we see his rooms?" Utterson asked. The woman looked at the lawyer and the policeman behind him and let them into the building. I always suspected that man would find trouble, she said. What has he done? Utterson and the policeman exchanged looks but said nothing. They followed the woman up to Hyde's apartment. The rich warmth of Hyde's rooms surprised Utterson. They were decorated with great luxury and taste. Fine art covered the walls and mantelpiece. He recognized several of the artists and knew the paintings were quite costly. The lawyer suspected that Dr. Jekyll had helped decorate. He knew a great deal about art. The rugs were hand-woven. The curtains were made of dark, heavy cloth. Utterson even noticed the expensive china and crystal about the rooms. He never would have thought of Hyde as a type of person to use such fine dishes. The rooms, however, were a mess. Clothes were scattered about the floor, drawers were left open and overturned. Ashes from recently burned papers filled the fireplace. The police examined the remains and discovered part of a checkbook. Thankfully, they could still read the account information. The name, Mr. Edward Hyde, was clearly labeled. This'll lead us to him, the police officer said. All his banking information is here. We can wait for him at the bank and nab him when he tries to withdraw his money. It seems so careless that he would leave this information behind, Utterson wondered aloud. Although he had only met Mr. Hyde once, Utterson did not think he was the type to be so forgetful. He had seemed so sneaky when they had met. He must have been in a terrible hurry, Utterson thought. The police officer shrugged his shoulders. At this point, we'll have him. Mr. Hyde will not slip away, he said. The police were convinced that the case would be closed almost immediately. They predicted that Hyde would be safely in jail by the next day. Well, I do hope you're right, Utterson remarked. Nothing would make me happier than to see the end of Mr. Edward Hyde. Chapter 9. The Incident of the Letter. Later that afternoon, Mr. Utterson went to find Dr. Jekyll. Poole let him in and led the lawyer to the laboratory across the yard. Dr. Jekyll is not feeling very well. Dr. Jekyll is not feeling very well today, Poole said. He prefers the quiet of the lab. Are you sure he's up for visitors? Utterson asked. Jekyll was so rarely available these days. The lawyer was surprised that he would see him when he was sick. The doctor said that if you stopped by, I should let you in straight away, Poole said. Everyone else should be turned away. Dr. Jekyll did not rise to meet his visitor. He remained by the fire, looking deathly sick. You've heard the news, Utterson said as soon as Poole had left them. The doctor shuddered. I heard it first thing this morning. They're always talking it over in London. Jekyll closed his eyes for a moment. The police were here this morning asking what I knew about Hyde. I'm asking you this question as your lawyer and your friend, Utterson said. You have not been mad enough to hide this man, have you? Utterson, I swear to God, he answered. I swear to God that I have never set eyes on Hyde again. It is all an end. And to be honest, he doesn't want my help. You do not know him as I do, Utterson. Mark my words. He will never be heard from again. You seem quite sure, the lawyer said. I hope you are right. I should warn you that if there is a trial, your name may be mentioned. Dr. Jekyll lowered his head. There were tears in his eyes. I am quite sure that he is gone. I've received a letter. I don't know if I should take it to the police. I'd rather leave it with you and let you decide what to do. I trust you completely. Are you worried that the letter may reveal Hyde's whereabouts? Utterson asked. He did not know why Jekyll was thinking about hiding the evidence. Was he still protecting Hyde? No, I have no concern about Hyde's fate now, Jekyll said. I'm quite through with him. His friend's behavior disturbed Utterson. He seemed quite upset. Jekyll was taking Sir Danvers' murder very badly. He must feel guilty for bringing Hyde into the neighborhood. Perhaps you should let me see the letter, Utterson said. It was written in odd, upright letters. It was stiff and awkward handwriting. It stated simply and clearly that Dr. Jekyll, his kind benefactor, should not worry, as he had means of escape. He was gone from the city and would not return. This message pleased Utterson very much. It was a great relief to know that Hyde was gone. May I see the envelope? Utterson said. I burned it, Jekyll said. I wasn't thinking clearly. It doesn't matter, though. There was no postmark. The police wouldn't be able to trace it. The note was hand-delivered this morning. Shall I keep this letter and think about what to do? Utterson asked. I leave it entirely in your hands. I have lost faith in my own judgment. Dr. Jekyll held his head in his hands. Tell me something, Jekyll, Utterson said. The odd terms in your will, making Hyde your heir in the case of death or disappearance were all his idea, weren't they? Jekyll nodded in his head slowly. I knew it, Utterson exclaimed. He meant to murder you. Once again, Jekyll shook his head. It was nothing like that, Utterson. I could never explain it to you. It was something between Hyde and me that no one else could share, and no one else will ever learn. But I've learned a lesson. Oh, what a lesson I have learned. He put his head back in his hands and wept. One more thing, Jekyll, Utterson spoke in a soft voice. He did not want to upset his friend more. Do you have any idea why Hyde did it? Was it a robbery, or did he have other reasons? Jekyll did not lift his head from his hands. No, he said. His voice was muffled. I have no idea. On his way out, the lawyer stopped to speak to Poole. There was a letter delivered today, Utterson said. What did the messenger look like? I would like to find that person who sent it. I'm sorry, sir, Poole said. We have had no mail today. This news surprised Utterson. The letter must have come by the laboratory door, the one Hyde used to use. It seemed strange that Jekyll would answer a door himself, considering his state of mind. The doctor said that he received the letter after the visit from the police. Perhaps the note had been written in the study. If so, that meant that Hyde was with Jekyll when he wrote it. But that would mean that Jekyll had lied to him. If he was willing to trust the lawyer with the note, why wouldn't he trust the lawyer with the truth? Utterson left Jekyll's home, confused and concerned. Chapter 10. Utterson examines the letter. Utterson made his way to his office. All the talk in the streets, in the entire city for that matter, was about the murder of Sir Danvers Carew. Suddenly, everyone knew the name Edward Hyde. It was hard for Utterson to mourn one person while worrying about another. His mind was swimming with questions and concerns. A fog had rolled into the city. One could not see from one corner to the next. London looked like a thick gray soup. Utterson thought this weather suited his mood. Nothing was clear anymore. He understood nothing. Mr. Guest, Utterson's assistant, offered his sympathies as soon as the lawyer walked through the door. It's awful news about Sir Danvers, Guest said. Yes, indeed, Utterson replied. This man, Hyde, is mad, of course. Utterson and Guest shared many secrets with one another. Their work demanded a great deal of honesty between them. The topic of Hyde and his connection to Jekyll had already been discussed. Guest had worked with Utterson in finalizing the strange will. The lawyer hoped that Guest would have a fresh point of view on the letter. He told his assistant about his visit to Dr. Jekyll and the note that Hyde had sent. I have a document here written in the killer's own hand, the lawyer said. May I look at it, sir? The guest asked. I was hoping you could offer your expert advice, Utterson said. Guest studied the art of the handwriting. He firmly believed that handwriting told a great deal about a person. What can you tell me about this Mr. Hyde? Utterson gave Guest the note. Guest took his time looking over the note. At long last, he lifted his head from the desk. Well, sir, Guest said, I don't believe he's mad, but it is certainly an odd style of writing. The mailman interrupted their conversation. He placed the morning mail on Guest's desk and left. Utterson started to sort through the letters. Sir, Guest said, is that the letter from Dr. Jekyll? Utterson said that it was. I thought so, Guest exclaimed. I recognize the handwriting. Is it something personal? Utterson quickly opened it. Why, no, he said. He was confused by his assistant's eager questions. It's an invitation to dinner. Would you mind if I looked at it as well? Guest asked. The assistant laid the two pieces of paper by side on the desk. He examined them both for some time. Why do you compare them, Guest? The lawyer asked. He was both curious and upset by his assistant's actions. Well, sir, said the clerk, there are many similarities between the two. At many points, both styles are identical. They have a different slope, that's all. Well, that's strange, Utterson said. Very strange, sir. The two men looked at each other. They were not certain of what all of this meant, but they knew it was serious. I wouldn't speak of this note, you know, said Utterson. No, sir, replied Guest. I understand. That night, Utterson locked the note in his safe at home. He thought it was best if no one else had the chance to see the writing. I never thought it possible, Utterson thought. Henry Jekyll forging a note for a murderer? And his blood ran cold in his veins. Chapter 11. The remarkable incident with Dr. Lanyon. The police officer offered thousands of pounds for the arrest of Sir Danvers' Carew murderer. Mr. Hyde, however, was nowhere to be found. It was as if he had dropped off the face of the earth. Not one person had caught even a glimpse of him since the night of the terrible murder. Hyde was certainly the talk of the city, though. Vile stories of his cruelty and evil deeds were told on every street corner, office, and home, each more awful than the last. Utterson thought this was a particularly brutal case, but oddly, the death of one man, Sir Danvers, resulted in the renewal of another man's spirits. Dr. Jekyll came out of hiding. He saw old friends again. He began hosting parties and attending social engagements. Utterson also noticed that Jekyll had even become more religious. The doctor had always been a charitable man, but was suddenly more devoted to his prayers and attended church services. For 2 months, Jekyll seemed healthy and happy. Many people commented on how relaxed and at peace he looked. The dinner party that had been announced in the curious invitation was held on the 8th of January. Mr. Utterson and Dr. Lanyon were both guests. The two men noticed their host's happy face throughout the evening. He was clearly pleased to spend the evening with two of his oldest friends. Certainly, he was remembering when the three had been best of friends. Utterson felt a familiar happiness. He was confident that life was back on track. On the 12th of January, though, and again on the 14th, the door to Jekyll's home was closed to visitors. On both nights, Utterson dropped by unannounced. Poole told him that the doctor wished to see no one. When he was rejected again on the 15th, Utterson began to worry. Jekyll was falling back into his old patterns of hiding. Utterson was reminded of the days when Hyde had control over his friend. It was much worse this time, though. It was unusual for Jekyll to cut himself off so completely. Utterson decided to visit Dr. Lanyon. Perhaps the good doctor would have some advice. Utterson was admitted into Dr. Lanyon's study. He was shocked at what he had found. Something awful had affected Lanyon's appearance. He was pale and sickly and looked at death's door. Lanyon looked like he had aged 30 years in the week since Utterson had last seen him. "My word, Lanyon," Utterson said as he stepped closer to his friend. He knelt beside the doctor's chair and took his hand. Utterson came here on a mission to save one friend. It shocked him to think that he might have to worry about saving two. Whatever could be wrong? Where did the sickness come from? Lanyon shook his head. "No," he said. "I'm not ill. I've received a terrible shock. It will be my end, though. My days are numbered." "Jekyll is ill too? Have you seen him?" Utterson asked. Lanyon's face changed, and he held up a trembling hand. "I wish to see or hear no more of Dr. Jekyll," he said in a loud, unsteady voice. "I am quite done with him. He is dead to me now." Said Mr. Utterson, after considerable pause. The lawyer asked if he could do anything. "We are three old friends," Utterson pleaded. "One can never replace an old and dear friend." "Nothing can be done," returned Lanyon. "Ask him yourself if you need further understanding." "He will not see me," said the lawyer. "I'm not surprised," Lanyon said. "Someday, Utterson, after I'm dead, you may come to understand some of the story. I cannot tell you. It's far too upsetting. In the meantime, if you'd like to sit and talk about other subjects, then I would love for you to stay. If you insist on discussing the case of Dr. Jekyll, then I must ask you to leave immediately." Utterson stayed with his friend. They talked of old times and friends in common. Everyone except Dr. Jekyll. After a few hours, the lawyer said goodbye and left his friend alone. Chapter 12. A letter from Dr. Lanyon. As soon as Utterson returned home, he wrote a letter to Dr. Jekyll. Utterson complained about being turned away repeatedly and expressed concern for Jekyll's health. He also asked the cause of Jekyll's unhappy break from Lanyon. The lawyer felt very frustrated. He was almost at his wit's end. A reply arrived the next day. It was long and sometimes confusing letter. Jekyll started his letter by saying that his break with Lanyon was permanent. "I do not blame him, of course," Jekyll wrote, "but I agree that he and I should never speak again. In truth, I intend to lead a life of seclusion from this day on. Please do not be hurt or upset if my door is closed to even you, Utterson. This is the way it must be. I have brought this punishment on myself. If I am the chief of sinners, I am also the chief of sufferers. Until this time, I had no idea that life could hold such agony. Utterson, if you wish to ease my pain in any way, please respect my silence." Utterson was amazed. Mr. Hyde and his evil influence were long gone. Not a week ago, Jekyll had been healthy, happy, and heading toward a contented old age. That they had returned to the routine of dinners together and evenings by the fire. Other friends had commented on Jekyll's fine spirits. Utterson had believed that the threat of Hyde was over and done with. Whatever could have happened in so short a time? Less than 2 weeks later, Dr. Lanyon died. The church was filled with mourners, as Dr. Lanyon had many friends. Everyone was shocked by how quickly he had died. Only Utterson had suspected that the end was near. But of course, he had nothing to do with the other mourners. How could he have ever explained the connection with Jekyll, especially since Utterson felt that he too had been left in the dark? That night, after the funeral, Utterson sat alone in his den. Sitting by the light of a single candle, he pulled an envelope out of his pocket. Lanyon's lawyer had given it to him after the funeral. It read, "For the eyes of G.J. Utterson alone. If I, Dr. Lanyon, should outlive Mr. Utterson, this letter must be destroyed unread." The lawyer bravely broke the seal of the envelope. Inside was another sealed envelope that read, "Not to be opened until the death or disappearance of Dr. Henry Jekyll." The words shocked Utterson. This was the same as Dr. Jekyll's strange will concerning Mr. Hyde. It was Dr. Lanyon's handwriting on the envelope. Why would Lanyon be concerned about Jekyll's disappearance? And why would Lanyon suspect that Jekyll might disappear one day? As both a trustworthy friend and a lawyer, Utterson placed the sealed envelope in the farthest corner of his safe. He hoped the day would never come when he would have to open it. He feared the truth might be too hard to bear. Utterson continued to call on Jekyll, but with less frequency. The lawyer had to admit to himself that he was often relieved when Poole turned him away. He settled into a new routine and found comfort in it. Utterson knew that he would worry less if he kept busy. On one of his visits to Jekyll's home, Utterson asked Poole if the doctor was feeling any better. The butler reported that his master was seen less and less, even within the household. Utterson noted that Poole looked worried. "He spends most of his time in that room above the laboratory," Poole said. "In fact, Dr. Jekyll often sleeps there. I leave his meals outside the door and return later to retrieve the empty trays." Poole looked like he wanted to say more. He hesitated over a few words, then stopped. At last he said, "I'll tell my master that you were here." Utterson thanked Poole and left. It was clear that Poole was worried about Jekyll's health and how much time he had spent alone. The lawyer was surprised to hear him, that even the doctor's servants rarely saw him. Utterson wondered if he had lost his good friend forever. Chapter 13. Incident at the Window. Despite the strange events of recent months, Utterson never missed his Sunday walk with Mr. Enfield. The lawyer took great pleasure in this ritual. There were times when he felt it was this connection to the world that kept him sane. His life had been so confusing and difficult, worrying over Dr. Jekyll's health. These walks reminded him of a time when his life felt normal. He missed his daily routines. Worrying so much about his friend was very tiring. Mr. Utterson hoped he would soon return to his simple life of quiet evenings at home and dinner parties with friends. He hoped that Jekyll would be better soon. On one of these journeys, Utterson and Enfield once again happened upon the door where the story began. They both stopped to look at it. The door was still in need of a fresh coat of paint, and the lock was damaged. It looked as though someone had tried to pry it open. Mr. Utterson thought about how much his life had changed since Enfield had first shown him this door. In a strange way, he felt responsible, although he knew it made no sense. Utterson wondered if just hearing that story had led to everything that followed. Perhaps seeking out Hyde and looking for answers had caused more harm than good for Dr. Jekyll. Maybe Hyde had made things difficult for him. Jekyll might still be suffering the ill effects of Hyde's abuse and blackmail. Utterson was learning to accept that he might never know the truth. "Well," said Mr. Enfield, "at least the story is at an end. We will hear no more of Mr. Hyde." The citizens of London still discussed the disappearance of Hyde. Nothing had been seen of him since the murder of Sir Danvers Carew. Many newspaper writers thought Hyde must have left England. There were rumors of sightings in Germany and France. One report had Hyde as far away as China, but there was no proof. Other people thought the criminal had escaped to Scotland. Then there were those people who thought he was still in London. They were certain that Hyde was waiting for him the right moment to come back and attack his next victim. I hope you're right, said Mr. Utterson. Did I ever tell you that I once met him? I shared your feeling of disgust. I think it would be impossible not to, Enfield replied. And by the way, I apologize for not realizing sooner that this door was a back way into Dr. Jekyll's house. I knew he was your dear friend, of course, but I did not realize while I was telling you that upsetting story that the house belonged to Jekyll. I'm deeply sorry if I offended you. Do not trouble yourself, Utterson said. I must tell you I am quite worried about Jekyll. He has not been well for some time. Would you mind if we stepped into the courtyard of his building? Utterson asked. I'd like to take a look at the windows. Of course, Enfield replied. Perhaps we could encourage Jekyll to join us on our walk. The more the merrier, I say. The courtyard was cool and a little damp, although the afternoon sun was still high in the sky. Twilight shadows fell inside the court. Dr. Jekyll's staff was careful about cleaning the courtyard and tending the flowers. Normally, it was filled with green plants and colorful flowers. Utterson had spent many a happy afternoon sitting with Jekyll in the courtyard, talking for hours. On this day, though, it looked lonely from neglect. The leaves had turned brown from lack of water. There were no flowers to enjoy. Grass and weeds grew around the stones and the footpath. The bird bath was empty. Utterson knew this was not a good sign. Jekyll would never allow the yard to look so messy if he was healthy and happy. The two men looked up at the windows above the laboratory. The middle one was slightly open. Sitting close behind it, slumped in a chair, was Dr. Jekyll. Hello, Jekyll, Utterson called. I trust you're feeling better. The doctor turned slowly toward the voice in the courtyard. He looked confused, as if he had no idea there was a world beyond his window. His eyes softened as he recognized his old friend. I'm very low, Utterson, replied the doctor drearily. Very low indeed. It will not last long, thank God. You stay indoors too much, the lawyer said. You should come get some exercise. Why not join Mr. Enfield and me? Have you met my cousin, Mr. Enfield? On our walk. Come now, get your hat and come outside. You are very kind, Jekyll called from the window. I should like to, but it's quite impossible. I dare not go outside. Dr. Jekyll tried to smile. It was very good to see you, though, he said. Very good indeed. I would ask you and Mr. Enfield up, but the place really is not fit for visitors. We certainly don't want to trouble you, Dr. Jekyll, Enfield added. My cousin has told me so much about you that I was looking forward to a visit. I'm very sorry to disappoint you, Jekyll replied. He sounded truly sorry. I'm afraid we've missed the opportunity to enjoy each other's company. Then the best thing we can do is stay down there and talk with you, the lawyer said. He tried to sound happy and bright. I was just going to suggest the same thing, the doctor replied with a weak smile. But the words were hardly out of his mouth before his smile disappeared. An expression of complete horror quickly followed. Jekyll closed his eyes tightly. A grimace came across his face. He appeared to be in a great deal of pain. The two men watched in horror as the skin turned gray. Jekyll covered his face with his hands. He turned from the window and hunched over. They heard a low moan as he disappeared below the window frame. The two men in the courtyard were shocked by what they saw. Utterson tried to call out to his friend, but no sound came. He was shocked and a bit frightened. A moment later, the curtain was quickly drawn across the window. There was nothing they could do. The two men fled the courtyard without another word. They continued in silence for several blocks. As they looked at one another, they were both very pale. Utterson wanted to talk about what they had just seen. What had come over Jekyll as he sat by the window? What type of illness caused such a drastic change in his appearance? It had to be more than simple stress. The lawyer wondered if his friend had been poisoned. He knew that the Jekyll staff would never cause him harm. There was only one person who could cause such danger. Did this mean that Hyde was still nearby? Did he still have Jekyll under his control? The only thing Utterson knew for sure was that he and Mr. Enfield had just witnessed something awful. Mr. Utterson could only manage a few words. God forgive us, he said. Mr. Enfield only nodded his head very seriously. There were no words to describe what had just happened. Enfield knew that no one would believe him if he tried. They walked on, more in silence. Chapter 14, The Last Night. Mr. Utterson was haunted by what he had seen in the window, yet he felt powerless to do anything to help. He did his best to put the terrible image out of his mind. One night, however, as he was sitting By his fireside after dinner, he was surprised to receive a visit from Poole. "My goodness, Poole, what brings you here?" Utterson cried. "Is Dr. Jekyll ill?" "Mr. Utterson," the butler said. He was out of breath. Utterson wondered if the butler ran all the way over. "There's something terribly wrong." The butler was very nervous. Mr. Utterson offered Poole a seat. "Please take your time," the lawyer said. "You know the doctor what ways, sir," replied Poole. "You know how he shuts himself away. Well, he has locked himself in the office above the laboratory, and I'm very worried. It's much worse this time, Mr. Utterson. I'm afraid for my master's health. I think he may be in great danger." "Now, my good man," Utterson said, "what exactly are you afraid of?" "I've been afraid for a week now," Poole said, "and I can bear it no more." The butler shook his head in frustration. He could not look at the lawyer in the eyes. He sat with his hands on his knees to keep them from shaking. "I can bear it no more," he repeated. "Poole," the lawyer said, "you must tell me what has happened. Why are you so frightened for Dr. Jekyll?" I think there's been some foul play," said Poole hoarsely. "Foul play?" cried the lawyer. He jumped from his chair. Utterson heard the pounding in the chest. "What do you mean?" I can't say, sir," Poole said, "but will you come with me and see it for yourself?" Mr. Utterson answered by grabbing his coat and hat. He noticed the look of relief on Poole's face. The lawyer put his hand on the butler's shoulder. "We'll get to the bottom of this," Utterson said. The two men left for the house. It was a wild, unseasonably cold night. The men held their hats on against the wind. Dust and grit swirled through the air. Thin trees in the garden lashed themselves against the railing. Few people would brave such awful weather, so the streets were almost bare. Utterson thought the streets had never looked so lonely. He also felt a great sense of doom. He knew that this evening would bring something terrible. He feared the worst for Dr. Jekyll. As they approached Dr. Jekyll's house, Poole took his hat off, despite the cold, to wipe his sweaty brow. Poole had been rushing the whole way, but now he paused. When he spoke, his voice was harsh and broken. "Well, sir," he said, "here we are. I pray that all is well inside." "Amen, Poole," the lawyer said. Poole knocked on the front door with a code, 3 quick raps, then 2 slow ones. The door opened only a few inches, and a face peered out. "Is that you, Poole?" a woman's voice said. "It's all right," Poole said. "Open the door." Utterson and Poole entered the front room. It was brightly lit by a roaring fire, and the household servants were huddled together like a flock of sheep. At the sight of Mr. Utterson, one of the maids began to cry. The cook said, "It's Mr. Utterson!" She ran to him and threw her arms around his neck. "Why are you all here?" the lawyer asked. He sounded irritated. The servants should not be gathered by the fire in the front room. "They are all afraid," Poole said. The room remained quiet. Only the sobs of the maid could be heard above the roaring fire. "Jeremy," Poole said to the young man, "hand me some candles. We should get this deal at once." Poole's voice was sharp. His nerves were clearly rattled. "Mr. Utterson," Poole said. He took 2 lit candles from Jeremy and passed one to the lawyer. "Will you please follow me?" The butler then led the way through the house and into the courtyard.